Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to tackle some of the most common myths about the United States and, of course, we're going to bust them wide open with real facts and data. So, if you've ever heard someone say something that just didn't sound quite right about America, stick around, because we're setting the record straight. But first, let me give you a brief background about USA and its history. The United States of America grew from 13 colonies into a global superpower, gaining independence in 1776 and expanding westward. It emerged as a key player in World War I and World War II, and became a leader during the Cold War. Today, the United States consists of 50 states, each with its own government and culture. Despite challenges like 9/11 and economic recessions, it remains a dominant force in economics, military power, and global culture today. If you stick within the video till the end, I've got some bonus facts about the US that you definitely don't want to miss. And trust me, you'll want to hear them. So, let's dive into these crazy US facts, coming up next. And here's a little secret. Some of these facts might just surprise you. Ready? Let's see if you can guess them before we reveal the answer. Myth number 1, everyone in the US is rich. Let's clear up this one once and for all. The claim that everyone in the US is rich couldn't be farther from the truth. While America is home to some of the wealthiest people on the planet, income inequality is a real issue, and not everyone is swimming in cash. In fact, around 10.5% of Americans live below the poverty line. That's over 34 million people who face financial struggles every day. Meanwhile, the wealthiest 1% of Americans control a whopping 32% of the nation's wealth, which means the top earners hold an overwhelming portion of the economic pie. To put things in perspective, the median household income in the US is around $68,700. So, if you're making $500,000 or more a year, that's typically considered rich, and only the top 1% of earners make it to that level. So no, not everyone in America is living the high life, and the reality of income inequality paints a very different picture. Alright, so the idea that everyone in the US is rich, yeah, that's not quite right. Sure, you've got billionaires like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos making headlines, but the reality is a lot of people are living paycheck to paycheck. But hang on, if we're talking about wealth, what about those fancy mansions you see on TV? Let's dive into that myth next. In reality, only about 1 to 2% of Americans live in those big, flashy luxury homes you see in movies. The vast majority, they are living in mid-sized homes, around 1,500 to 3,000 square feet, which makes up about 50 to 60% of the population. And here's something even more surprising. Around 33 to 40% of Americans live in smaller homes or condos that are less than 1,500 square feet. So, when you picture an average American home, don't think mansion. Most people are living in spaces that are much more modest and manageable. Well, turns out, most Americans aren't living in massive mansions like we see in movies. Now, speaking of big things, there's another myth that's often thrown around, that everyone in the US owns a gun. Let's see if that holds up. This is the myth that gets tossed around a lot, the idea that everyone in the US owns a gun. While it's true that the US has the highest rate of gun ownership in the world, not every American is packing heat. In fact, according to a 2021 Gallup poll, only 32% of Americans personally own a firearm. And while 44% live in a household with a gun, that's still far from the everyone myth we often hear. Now, get this. The US has an estimated 393 million civilian-owned firearms, which actually exceeds the country's population of 331 million. This suggests that many gun owners don't just have one gun, they've got multiple. And here's something interesting. Gun ownership is more common in rural areas, with 47% of rural adults owning a gun, compared to just 19% in urban areas. So, while guns are definitely a part of American life, not everyone is armed and ready to go. But, hey, if we're talking about big numbers, we've all heard about fast food being a big part of American life, right? Well, that leads us to the next myth: Americans only eat fast food. Let's see how true that is. You've probably heard that Americans live on fast food, right? Well, while it's true that the US is home to some of the largest fast food chains in the world, saying that Americans only eat fast food isn't quite accurate. The US does account for about 40% of the global fast food market, with over 200,000 fast food restaurants scattered across the country. Think McDonald's, KFC, Subway. These guys are definitely major players. But here's where it gets interesting. The fast food industry alone contributes around $300 billion to the US economy every year. Now, while it's true that about 38% of adults in the US indulge in fast food on any given day, that still leaves over 60% who prefer other meal options. So, yes, fast food is a huge part of American culture, but it's definitely not the only thing people eat. Fast food may be super popular, but it's not all that's on the menu. Not every meal is a burger and fries. But hey, let's move on from food to a more serious topic, obesity. Are all Americans really as unhealthy as the social media makes it seem? Let's bust that myth. Obesity is certainly a significant health issue in the US, but saying that all Americans are obese, that's definitely not accurate. Around 42.4% of adults in the US are considered obese, and a whopping 73.1% are either overweight or obese. But hold up, that still means more than 25% of Americans are not classified as obese. So, while obesity is a growing concern, it's far from universal. Now, here's a myth that you might be familiar with. Everyone in the US is Christian. But is that really the case? Let's break it down. While it's true that about 70.6% of Americans identify as Christian, that doesn't mean everyone falls into that category. 22.8% of Americans are religiously unaffiliated. And it doesn't stop there. The US is home to people who follow other major religions too, like Judaism, 2.4%, Islam, 1.1%, Hinduism, 0.7%, and Buddhism, 0.7%. Plus, there's a 6.6% of the population practicing a variety of other faiths. Now you know, America is a diverse mix of beliefs. Let's dive into another stereotype. Americans only speak English. Is that the whole story? Let's find out. While English is definitely the most common language, it's far from the only one spoken. In fact, about 21.9% of the US population speaks a language other than English at home. The most widely spoken non-English language? Spanish, with 13.5% of Americans speaking it. But that's not all. The US is a linguistically diverse country. Chinese is spoken by 1.2%, Tagalog by 0.6%, and Vietnamese and Arabic are each spoken by about 0.5% of the population. Now, while we're talking about language, here's another myth that everyone in the US drives a car. But is it really true? Let's take a look. While it's true that a whopping 91.5% of US households own at least one vehicle, that doesn't mean everyone is behind the wheel. In fact, about 88% of Americans age 16 and older drive regularly. But that still leaves around 12% who don't drive regularly, or at all. And get this, 8.5% of US households don't own a car at all. So, no, it's not all cars and highways here. Speaking of transportation, here's a big one. The US has no public transportation. Time to clear this one up. Public transit is actually used by about 5% of Americans, which is around 16.5 million people. But here's where it gets interesting. The usage is way higher in big cities. Take New York City, for example, where 55% of the population, that's about 4.8 million people, rely on public transportation to get around. That's a huge chunk of people. In fact, 54% of the US population lives in metropolitan areas with access to some form of public transit. That's about 179 million people. However, if you're living in a more rural area, well, the options are a bit more limited. Here's one last myth for today. The US is just big cities. Is that the whole picture? Let's find out. So when you think of the US, it's easy to picture big cities like New York or Los Angeles, right? But here's a surprising fact. While about 82.3% of Americans, or roughly 272 million people, live in urban areas, the majority of US land isn't actually urbanized. In fact, the suburban population makes up about 52% of the country's total population, which is more than half. And get this, around 17.7%, or 58 million people, still live in rural areas. So, despite the large cities, the US is a mix of bustling metropolises, quiet suburbs, and wide-open rural spaces. Sure, major cities like New York City and Los Angeles might grab all the attention, but they only represent about 15% of the entire US population. So, there you have it. We've busted 10 myths about the US today. What do you think? Were any of these surprises for you? Let us know in the comments below. Before we wind up, since you watched this video till the end, let's dive into the bonus facts we promised you in the beginning of the video. The US is also the third largest country in the world by land area, coming in behind Russia and Canada. When it comes to the economy, the US takes the crown as the world's largest with a nominal GDP of a staggering $26.7 trillion. And speaking of economic powerhouses, New York City is home to the New York Stock Exchange, or the NYSE, which is the world's largest stock exchange by market capitalization, valued at over $40 trillion as of 2024. Let's not forget about US-based companies. Names like Apple, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Tesla, Nvidia, Berkshire Hathaway, Meta, Facebook, and Johnson & Johnson are among the largest companies in the world. And when it comes to military spending, the US leads the world with a defense budget of $831 billion in 2024, making up more than 30% of global military expenditure. That's all for today. If you want more fun facts like these or want to learn more about the United States, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Drop a comment letting me know which fact surprised you the most. And if we hit 100 likes, I'll make another deep dive into more incredible US facts. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.